name is Eddie Gross. I'm a shareholder at Vedder Price. It's a law firm, lots of different cities all over the world. I'm in the DC office. I'm in the Global Transportation Finance Group. That's my perspective, which isn't much. So that's why we have all these smart people who really can talk about forecasting. I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves and give you the pertinent information about who they are. Michael?
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Dyment. I'm with NEXA Capital Partners. We are an aerospace investment bank. My background is 40 years in aerospace, mostly finance.
Hi, I'm Ken Swartz. I'm Regional Director for the Americas for the Vertical Flight Society, which was founded in 1943. I've got 3 decades of aviation experience in terms of short-haul, commuter and regional airline, and helicopter operators and OEMs. Worked with Bombardier for many years. And I've also been writing on the aviation sector, both airlines and helicopters, for the last 3 years for about a dozen magazines.
Yep, and Brian Foley, AvStrategies. I've been matching aviation investors with great companies since 2006. Some of you may know me from my alter ego company, Brian Foley Associates, or BRIFO for shorts, you know, J-Lo, BRIFO, that sort of thing. But
when he's not filming Breaking Bad.
No. And that, I don't have my glasses on, or I'd look like Cranston. And so Brian Foley Associates looks after market research and that sort of thing. Before that, I was with Boeing for a number of years, Dassault Falcon Jet, and I even was affiliated with an investment bank on Wall Street as a Series 7 registered rep, matching aviation companies with investors.
Hello, everyone. I'm Doug Reinart. I'm a partner with Porsche Consulting. I actually presented here a year ago. I beamed my colleague from Oktoberfest in Munich here in his Lederhosen and got in a lot of trouble for that. So they let me just come back if I promise not to do that again. So Porsche Consulting is a wholly owned entity of Porsche, the car company, as well as being part of the Volkswagen Group. So our focus in the consultancy is applying transformation activities that we're driving within our group, both back into the group and then also with external clients, primarily in automotive, aerospace, and industrial goods. So really happy to be here today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Toby Strobel. I am strategy consultant with Business Models Inc. And we're specializing in business model development and also business model innovation. And before that, I was working for Airbus Group Innovations in Munich in Germany. And at that time, I was developing systems for electric aviation, so more specifically in-flight ice protection systems, and I did that for about 5 years.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Okay, so, all right, not working. There we go. This is our agenda. We're going to roll through this. Series of questions. Feel free to participate. First question. Michael, how would you explain the science and magic of forecasting for an evolving market in 3 minutes or less?
Well, it's a black art, as we all know. Our investors are a mix of infrastructure funds and direct investment institutions. And among other things, we finance the ADS-B network that exists in the United States. Just to give you an example of what we do. We've been looking at urban air mobility for a couple of years, trying to figure out whether investing in the sector would be the right thing to do. And in the end, we decided that the market studies that were performed by Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, et cetera, were just too high level to make sense of. So we took it upon ourselves on behalf of our investors to examine urban air mobility in a very unique way from the bottom up. So we basically tackled the view of urban air mobility in 74 different cities. We developed demand models for each of these cities separately. We analyzed the cost of new infrastructure like vertiports. We looked at vehicle demand, et cetera. I wanted to suggest that if any of you were ready to jump off the edge after Kirsten Bartok gave her presentation this morning, we really have a very different view about it. This is very much a disintermediated market opportunity. and cities are going to evolve independently of each other. And it will be on the strength of consortia that go after the opportunities in these cities or urban areas that will create the investment opportunities. Forecasting is tricky. We intend to update our forecasts quarterly for the next 5 years, just to let our investors and subscribers know that there's really no perfect forecasting. As better assumptions come along, they need to be used. So I'll just continue with this slide because this is one of mine. For the 74 cities, we analyzed 5 different services: airport shuttle, on-demand air taxi, corporate or business aviation, regional air transport, and medical and emergency. Now, a couple of these markets are price inelastic. Business aviation, for example, price is not the issue. It's convenience, location, et cetera. And of course, medical and emergency sectors, those are not price sensitive, price elastic either. So we had to really carefully construct and analyze the opportunity from the standpoint of the differences in each of these city markets. We forecasted about 1.3 billion passengers over 20 years in these 74 cities. Infrastructure costs about 31 billion. That included new vertiports, for example, but also the UTM infrastructure needed for safe operations. And lastly, operator revenues and vehicle costs. So one rule of thumb we have established already is that for every dollar one spends on ground infrastructure and UTM, this could produce a minimum of $10 in operator revenues. So it's from our standpoint as infrastructure funds, we like to see these types of ratios.
Terrific. So that's a perspective about forecasting and somewhat granular. It does pertain to this market. Any of the other panelists, different perspective in terms of whether the general aspects of forecasting or relative to this market that you would mention? Anybody? Anybody? Not hearing anybody? It's okay. Let's move on to UAM potential, right? So that's
yeah. These were outputs from some of our financial models that looked at 20-year revenue potential city by city. So what we did find is that even the smaller cities still had there's a viability there, especially with regional air transport. So if you're not going to support the close-in city center type of on-demand air taxi, regional air transport is a big problem for smaller cities, and being able to go 200 miles or 150 miles through a convenient scheduled or on-demand service is quite a viable investment.
Thanks. And I was particularly pleased when I read that whole damn report, and one of the cities listed was Baltimore. I was so excited. That's my hometown. I was so surprised. Okay, let's have Ken participate here. Ken, are we overthinking the forecasting for all these fancy aviation assets? Because after all, there already are urban mobility assets, and can't we just extrapolate from that?
Well, I'm coming at this sort of being ambidextrous, being both a helicopter person and a fixed-wing person in terms of regional airlines, and also sort of steeped in a bit of the history, because Vertical Flight Society was founded as the American Helicopter Society back in 1943 by the pioneers of vertical flight who were rejected by the fixed-wing community and realized that they needed to advocate and create a community of technical sharing to advance the technology. And in some ways, we're seeing a repeat of what occurred before. The way we look at it, we just posted our 209th aircraft on the website today, and will be 3 more this week. You can segment these aircraft into 7 different market segments. Each of these market segments, there will be some winners and there'll be a lot of losers. It's a challenge, as we've seen historically, both with helicopters and with the X-plane programs, to actually perfect the technology and also to perfect a business model that's both profitable for the OEM and for the operator. Next slide. So if we look at the market today, if we agree that the market segment we're in is short-haul air transport, And there's a helicopter component, and there's a fixed wing or regional airline, commuter airline component. When we look at the landscape, we see a couple things. One, short-haul air service has contracted since 2000. The number of routes lost short-haul on the fixed-wing side has been substantial. Someone put it at about 20 billion in the U.S. alone. There's been a 48% reduction on the fixed-wing side. But if we look at helicopter airlines, high mortality rate, there's 28 helicopter airlines currently flying today. Most of them are niche markets. We have, in many different countries, there's been the whole Los Angeles and New York examples. In the past, there was a second round with Airspur and the WG-30 aircraft in the 80s, but it's a challenge. When we look at offshore ops, just to benchmark the numbers of people flying by helicopter today, in the Gulf of Mexico, it's 1.2 million people on a fleet of 336 aircraft, and that is about half of what it was 15 years ago. The market's contracting, and they're going further offshore. An important aspect is stall ports. When we look at technology, new aircraft plus infrastructure, where have there been success stories? Stall ports, I worked at de Havilland, that was their culture. London City
What does
Airport,
STOL stand for?
short takeoff and landing.
Thank
The
you.
idea that you can create an aircraft and operate it from a shorter runway or a greenfield site. London City Airport is the best example, where you took a dock and turned it into a stall port. What did they achieve? They achieved 5 million passengers last year. Toronto Airport is 2.5, 4,000-foot runway. Norwegian government created a whole network, 29 airports. They're going electric. Scheduled seaplane is also a short-haul segment that exists in some markets in a very changed behavior kind of way. In other places, it has potential. Next slide.
Sorry.
So to just give you a sort of real-world example today, my hometown of Vancouver, what you see there is 400,000 people a year flying off airport or runway independent between Vancouver, Vancouver Island. Behavior has changed, and it's not just a business travel scenario, but it's across all segments, and the price points vary. And you have competing scheduled helicopter service and seaplane service. From two terminals that are on either side of the cruise ship terminal in Vancouver. It's a multimodal hub with subways, rail, and there's an ATC tower on the top of a 500-foot office building that's been there for 40 years. So when you have the right combination of economical aircraft, the right city pairs, the ideal infrastructure, and fare-paying passenger, history has shown that the market can grow. But if one of those elements is missing, that's where the challenge is.
Just so you'll know, on Michael's list, Baltimore was higher than Vancouver in terms of GDP, just in case you were wondering. Any other thoughts about what we just heard from Ken? No, not hearing anything. There's a polling question, I think, that's next. If we can see that on Slido, maybe? There we go. Right, so there's a general question for you. After what you've heard so far, you know, when it's fairly topic specific, let's see what you're thinking. Actually, we'll let you keep thinking about that and responding while we're going on to the next thing, because your answer is likely to change as things go by, or not. Okay, great. So there are various UAM types, right? So a great deal of the market focus and investment relates to eVTOLs, but the evolving market is and will be broader than that, we think. Right, Doug?
Yeah. Yes, and you can advance the slide.
Oh, okay,
this
great.
didn't actually render appropriately. There we go.
Got it.
We can go to the next one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah? Good?
It's blank. So
Not
there's
my
actually
fault.
something on that.
Oh, I see. I got to
it
populate
builds. That's
it.
awful. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no
the
problem.
dreaded slide build. So we undertook a study. It's about a year and a half ago. We've published it. Many of you may have actually seen or read that study. We continue to update it. We looked across different subsegments of the vertical mobility market. So we looked at obviously the transport of people, so the passenger market. we looked at the goods market, we looked at the industrial market, primarily inspection and other applications specific to certain industries for unmanned craft, and then we looked at all of the supporting services that underlie that. So from our perspective, we wanted to look at that as a broader context. We just ignore the, and actually there'll be one more build on this, just ignore those numbers at the top. So for us, when we looked at how we modeled this, there were four main drivers of how this ecosystem would evolve. Obviously the technology, and we're talking a lot about that. Many technology challenges that we're going to hear lots over the next 2 days as to the progress being made on that, key driver. But I think it's our contention that in all these markets, it's not so much the proof of concept, but it's the proof of value. And so where does that start to come out? And that's where we get into some of the other items here. Social acceptance, that's noise, that's accessibility, that's integration with existing modes of transport, and then regulatory, of course, and then all the infrastructure around it. So for us, I'm not going to belabor this. I think we'll go to the next one, which is actually the, okay, maybe we'll stop there for a second. So we then looked at cities. We modeled cities in actually a similar manner. We looked at, and we created these archetype cities based on geography, wealth, population density, primary modes of mobility, and regulatory governmental influences. So we created these sort of categories of cities, and these were then modeled, and we would take representatives of each and then model in detail how those transportation patterns might evolve as we introduced urban mobility through the air, through eVTOLs. And then finally, of course, it has to actually come back to a business case. So that's all these drivers: accessibility, performance, from an end-to-end perspective, and then price and cost. So I'll just go to the next slide and just tell you kind of how we come out at this, and I think maybe it might be a bit conservative. Let me just say that this doesn't talk to goods, it doesn't talk to infrastructure, it doesn't talk to the industrial inspection businesses. We're back now on the passenger view of the world, and this is specifically, these bars are specific to intra-city, not inter-city. So in our base case, we see this evolving into about a $21 billion market. And that can be driven through 15,000 active units, actually, across somewhere around 40 cities. Let's just take the more progressive case, and I'll leave it as an even more optimistic answer because people tend to think these are low numbers. But on the progressive side, we see that it could be as much as a $58 billion market, which is a pretty substantial business in and of itself, and somewhere in the order of 43,000 active units. And again, those bars are related only to intra-city. City to city is probably anywhere from $11 to $20 billion as we see it in the market. And so I would just tell you that in general, we see the total addressable market for the passenger business as something closer to $230 billion and as many as 200,000 active units. It's just that when you start to consider all the different constraints, social acceptance, infrastructure, regulatory, we believe that we're really realistically in this range, and we hope to be proven wrong, but that's how we see the market.
Terrific, thanks. Brian, why do we need eVTOLs when we can rely on high-speed helicopters?
Can I get back to you on that? Let me.
No, that's why you're here.
Let me walk you through high-speed helicopters.
Were you standing up because you're actually going to walk?
No, I have.
all right.
I have happy feet, kind of
All right,
like
gotcha.
Ellie. Yeah. So.
No.
For those that aren't familiar, a high-speed helicopter is a new concept that's out there. There's a couple of prototypes flying. But physics today limits a helicopter to about 150 knots or so. They just can't go any faster. But by tricking that a little bit, there's some ideas out there to press it up to 250 knots. And there's a number of companies doing this, so I'm not really talking out of school. But I was engaged by a very large helicopter manufacturer to answer some questions for them. And maybe we can all commiserate if any of you were in the same seat with that kind of task at hand. But the first thing they asked me is, if we did do a high-speed helicopter, how many are we going to sell? And how many are we going to sell in 20 years, by each year? And while you're at it, how many of those would be military and how many would be civil? And while you're doing that, in military, how many are going to be combat aircraft? How many are going to be maritime, marine transport, all the different segments that are in military helicopters? And on the civil side, there's another half dozen or so. Year by year, how many are we going to sell? And the last request is by small, medium, and large cabin too. So I suspect that there's at least a couple in this room that have the same tall task at hand. And I'm really here just to lend support. And I'll show you in one slide what took 4 months to do, that there is a way to approach it. You know, they say sometimes that forecasts are an educated guess. I'd say maybe they're an educated estimate. But as long as you have some reasoning behind it and some good, you know, solid numbers going forward, you can make a reasonable pass at it. So I'll show you how I went about doing that, Eddie. So I've broken each box into basically each step that I went through to come up with this. And the first thing you have to do is do some research on a few things. And the first thing is to find some analogous program that's been out there before that you can maybe get a little, you know, feedback from. You know, for us, it was things like tilt rotors, if you're familiar with those, and how those performed in the market, and which segments they lent themselves to, how pricing, you know, affect the market and the acceptance of it. And you start getting, you know, a little appreciation just by looking at something out there that's happened before. We could go back and look at, you know, how many helicopters were delivered in each of those 12 or so segments over time to give us an idea of which segments order the most helicopters. You know, there's a couple other things you can look at, but probably the most important thing of this research step is to talk to other operators that are out there, or your typical customer, I should say, that would buy something like this in the different segments, and ask them questions. You know, do a little survey out there. You know, what do you think of this high-speed concept if you could go this much faster? And what would you pay for that, you know, ability to do so? You know, how would direct operating costs, if they're a little higher, affect your decision? And by the time you talk to different people in all these different groups out there, you have a little guidance and their price sensitivity to the idea. So quickly going through then, you know, you can make some assumptions in step 2, you know, what it's going to cost, what the direct operating costs will be. Step 3, where you make some estimates on, you know, the market capture by price premium and other things. And by the end, you get to step 4, and you have a nifty little model where you can change different, you know, variables as far as the cost of the airplane, the direct operating cost, and it'll flow through the whole model and show you segment by segment how many you'll sell, you know, in the next 20 years. And again, it's an estimate. It's not perfect, but a place to start. So I encourage you to keep pressing on.
So, Brian, are we talking about a spectrum of high-speed helicopters, but including, you know, the equivalent of an eVTOL, you know, something that won't be powered by the usual carbon-based fuel?
Yeah, high-speed helicopters are a very different market than UAM. You know, high-speed helicopters have to get 19 oil workers out to a derrick, you know, 300 miles out to sea. It's great for maybe EMS, emergency medical services, because of that golden hour of trying to get the patient to the hospital. So there's, I think a high-speed helicopter is almost doing the job with a sledgehammer instead of a regular hammer.
Okay, thanks very much. Panelists, any questions about that?
I'll just add the Vertical Flight Society has been quite involved in this sector with U.S. government's future vertical lift. And one of the things that the organization got involved in was actually lobbying Congress for additional R&D funding to the tune, I guess, the last 5 years, we've been able to bring in additional $70 million to the R&D, because the OEMs, in this particular case, the government has a requirement, but the OEMs, in terms of company-funded R&D, were finding a shortfall. And so there was actually an effort to top up the R&D funding in order to make the aircraft possible.
Great, thanks very much. Next topic, for which there's not an independent slide, really has to do with one of the most important elements of how we make this happen. So it was a great old baseball movie called Field of Dreams, and the question asked was, if we build it, will they come? Like for this particular industry, it's How much building before we can actually accelerate this use of mobility? Michael?
So there are investors in the room, I assume.
Raise your hand if you're an investor. All right.
Or if
so
you're not, you're shy.
There you go.
Okay.
The rest are prospective investors, right? So there you go.
Yeah, so a couple of things. Firstly, and I'll depart a little bit from the question by saying that we think that the early, the cities that will get involved first in sponsoring urban air mobility are probably not in the United States. They're not far away. Vancouver, for example, is a very good candidate. But of the 74 cities we looked at, there are about 10 outside the United States that are already active with respect to the formation of consortia. We may invest in infrastructure in 2 of these next year. And without infrastructure, whether it's revitalized heliports or brand new vertiports, there is no urban air mobility. I mean, you need to have the infrastructure in place. That costs money. It's a long-term bet, and very important from the standpoint of the viability of these markets. So the other point I'll make is that the last thing you want to do is attack these cities, these mega cities, right at the core. If you take London, for example, London has almost no heliports anywhere close to downtown. And the idea of putting new vertiports in London is so foreign to the city fathers there that the opportunity really is in the suburbs and exurbs. The city pair that looks the most interesting in London, in my view, is the Oxford-Cambridge. These 2 cities have the best education, universities in the UK. I hope I don't inflame any rivalries here. But these are about 70 miles apart as the crow flies, about a 2.5-hour drive by car or a 2.5-hour by public transportation because you have to go to downtown London to catch a train back to the other. And yet it's about a 20 to maybe 25-minute flight. There are about 300 or 400 people per day that go back and forth. The way to introduce urban air mobility with many of these cities is to start small and incrementally prove the reliability, the efficacy, the convenience, and to do so in areas where you can operate these vehicles without ever having to fly over a house. You can use commercial and industrial areas. You can use public waterways, et cetera. And to us, this is why we're going to see, and you'll begin to see profitable operations actually in a couple of years' time.
Michael, thanks. Let's, so Toby,
Yeah,
you're all the way over there. You waited. You were very patient. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
So flight hailing, right? So we already have helicopter hailing. Wouldn't it be easy to transition this to these newer and different assets? And therefore, shouldn't it be really cheap?
Yeah, so yeah, Eddie, when you kicked off our conversations in terms of how to forecast a market that doesn't exist, I was wondering immediately, does that market from a business standpoint, of course, really not exist, since we all know, we all get Ubers literally every day. And then also, I guess already that a bunch of you guys here in the room already hailed a helicopter to get from an airport to the city. Can we raise hands who already hailed a helicopter to get into a city from an airport? Okay, not that many.
How about to get from Manhattan to the Hamptons?
Maybe more. So, but in the end, it's like that means of transport, what you hail. So helicopter hailing, if you go to the next slide, Eddie. Helicopter hailing, it's already a big thing. So Uber just started, I think, in early July. Uber started helicopter hailing in New York. So instead of getting an Uber from JFK to Midtown Manhattan for about, I think like $90 to $95, you can get an Uber to New York. But you could also get now, if you're a Platinum or a Diamond member, you can also hail a helicopter and then fly in 8 minutes for about $200 to $225 into Manhattan. And also, like Blade is already around way longer, and they offer for about a little less than $200 that you have a 5 minutes flight from JFK to Manhattan, or you can also have like a $95 flat fee if you have the annual membership. And similar to that, the example of Airbus Room. So for about $150, you can kind of skip like a up to 2 hours ride from Sao Paulo Airport to the city center. So definitely the big question is here, what is the willingness of people to pay for saving the time to not be stuck in traffic? And then of course, if you look like that next step from with Uber, what they announced already, that their goal at the initial launch, once it comes to Uber Air, at the time of the launch, they want to provide the service for about $5 per the mile, and today it's about $10 per mile. But then in the future, at some point, they even want to bring down prices to about $2 to $3 per mile. So my question at this point also to you guys is, what would you be willing to pay for a flight in an electric VTOL per mile? So we have that also on the polling questions.
Slidos for me.
And let's say, it was keep the question before.
Yeah, right there.
So, and let's consider that flight from JFK to Manhattan, 20 miles. How much would you be willing to pay for that flight? And just as the comparison today in Uber, it's $93 for that ride.
Is it a reimbursable expense?
I don't think so. No, but
not if it's a government official.
And yeah, and also, of course, connected to that, maybe we'll leave it still for a few seconds. So yeah, more than $100. But then coming to that next question that you've seen already, which is also pretty interesting. So like, what's your number one criterion that you would say, okay, I do want to hail a flight instead of sitting into an Uber or in a cab or even taking the train to Manhattan? So what's that really that number one criteria? Is it speed? Is it cost? Or is it the entertainment and connected services in the future? And of course, yeah, should it be cheap for that reason?
Toby, what do you mean by the entertainment and connected services?
Well, in the future, I guess, of course, you will not fly. So it's more of it's an unmanned vehicle, so you will not fly yourself. So you might just open up your laptop. Maybe there's even like huge dashboards or screen in the inside of that eVTOL, so that you have kind of even like a connected environment. You can work there, take all your calls, have a Wi-Fi connection. All that in terms of connected services and being able to do whatever you would not be able if you just sit in a cab without Wi-Fi connection, or if you drive even yourself.
How about the difference between personal and business use?
Yeah, that's of course the big question. Are you willing to pay for that on your own if you cannot reimburse it to your company? So far, I guess when it comes to the ride hailing or like the flight hailing, actually. For most people, it would be, well, I would not do it if I'm on leisure travel because I can still afford, so time is not the number one criterion, it's more the cost, what we also see reflected here.
Okay, did you want to ask something, Doug?
No, I was just going to support some of these comments because I think the way we modeled the whole scenario is obviously it's more of a speed component in the equation. We felt that anything under a 20-kilometer journey, though, the speed, because of the transaction costs getting in and out of the locations, probably starts to break down a little bit, so it's a speed issue. And then in terms of dollars, we looked at this in terms of fully loaded costs, probably about $2.80 per mile of flying, so that's where you start thinking about a $36 or so break even for roughly a 20-kilometer trip. So that's kind of, from a business standpoint, you got to be able to support that with the convenience.
So, lightning round question for each of you. How soon will it be the case that there will be unmanned mobility that will have some measure of traction here in the States? And I don't mean air ambulances, because those people don't really have a choice, right? They're not worried about dying If they get on the aircraft, they're worried about it if they don't. So tell me what you think. And you can also take into account air ambulances. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, autonomy is well on the way, and it's already being done. With helicopters in some places in war zones, they automatically fly in cargo or supplies, whatever they need to do. So that's well on its way.
But carrying people.
Yeah. And as far as people, I mean, you could talk to the Boeing folks, but they're moving in that direction with the pilot shortage to try to see if there's a way to do a single pilot with a ground control backup, to that person. So it's coming. It won't happen in a day, but it'll be, stepped out over time.
We're learning these lessons right now on the two-dimensional plane with level 4, level 5 for cars, for vehicles, and I think we're now realizing that time frame is probably a little longer than what was discussed a year ago. So I would say that your question, probably 2030, where you start to see some meaningful routes, but very limited in terms of defined corridors in very limited use cases, and then seeing maybe some broader applications of fully autonomous flight, pilotless by 2035. That's
Do you
what we
think
would
the
say.
ground vehicles will have to be successful first before people will use them?
I don't necessarily. I think there's some carryover, but they are different. They're different mathematical problems that have to be solved. So I don't necessarily see that, but at some level, I think they'll follow in the same trajectory. I think we're still many, many years out from seeing full level 5.
Okay.
So yeah.
I would agree with that, by the way. We defined an inflection point in our 20-year forecast to come around 2030, where you would begin to see the first autonomous flights with passengers, about 10 years from now. And what that does is it triples the size of the market opportunity because costs fall, you can get more scale, and it's safer to get rid of the pilot.
Okay.
I think that you're going to have the data first collected in background from the UAM models, and it's only when you have a certain sizable amount of data that the confidence from the regulator will come that will allow for autonomous operations.
Yeah, and I also think it's more incremental. So like first we're going to have single pilot operations, and then maybe like operate from the ground, and then as a very last step it's fully autonomous. So, and that of course, I think it's hard to even predict that once, of course, regulations, once FAA says or EASA says, okay, now we're really good to fly fully autonomous. So it's like one step at a time in my mind.
Got it. I'm going to take the flashing lights to mean that we're done. Hint taken. Thank you. Thank you, Barry.
That was a great panel. Thank you very much.